It's about a 20-second delay. Okay, guys, we are live. And if you're wondering why I'm sitting on my couch, it's because, in my old age, I have back problems, so I need to sit on a couch and give my back a break. But we have our special guest with us for a second time, Brother James E. Snapp Jr. Now, guys, invite people. And I'm not exaggerating when I say you need to invite people. We need more people to hear this presentation and the presentation he gave on Mark 16, verses 9 to 20. We need this video and the previous session to go viral because there's too much misinformation by even well-intentioned Christian scholars that have misinformed the masses, causing them to doubt that Mark 16, verses 9 to 20 is genuine, God-breathed scripture, and that the woman caught in adultery wasn't originally written by the Apostle John. Thank the Lord Jesus, and I mean this from my heart. That's why I'm honored to have him here. Thank the Lord Jesus for brothers like James E. Snapp Jr. who've done their homework and will give you the other side, the side that many of these critics do not present, a side that shows you can trust that the woman caught in adultery is God-breathed scripture, inspired by God through John, thus saith the Lord. So praise God for this man. Pray for him. Support him. Read his material, disseminate it for the glory of Christ. So, Brother James, thank you for being here. It is an honor to have you, brother.
Thank you, Sam.
With that said, I'm going to recede in the background, mute my mic, and we're going to have our own brother Protestant serving us for the sake of Jesus, who's a blessing to the church. Thank you, Protestant. Let me go in the back. Let me bring him.
Hello. Thank you, Sam, for that introduction, and thank you for this opportunity to share some information about John chapter 7, verse 53 to John chapter 8, verse 11. Oftentimes, this passage is one of the most questioned passages in the Bible, or in the New Testament. The Christian Standard Bible's 2017 footnote is somewhat typical of the kind of treatment that this passage is given. You can see in the footnote here, it says that other manuscripts include all or some of the passage after John 7:36, 7:44, 7:52, which is where you usually see it, John 21:25, or after Luke 21:38. And many readers will see that footnote and think, well, some have it here, some have it there, some have it there, some have it there. Does it really belong here, or is this simply an indication that it doesn't belong in any of these places? And when we ask, is this passage original, it's important to bring that sum into focus. We need to take a close look at the sum. Very rarely in footnotes will you see a whole lot of detail. In the New King James Version, there's a footnote that says that over 900 manuscripts have the passage, and that's close. It's really, as of October 2019, according to Maurice Robinson, 1,499. So they're just a little bit off there by about 600 manuscripts. So with basically 1,500, to give a nice round number there, have this passage either in the main text or the margin and inserted leaf, or relocated elsewhere in John or Luke. On the other hand, there are 268, and again, this data is probably not as updated as yesterday, but that ratio will hold pretty well at any particular time. You could say 1,500 manuscripts included, and about 270 do not. Of that 270 that do not, you know that it's an axiom among textual critics, and it's a good one too, to say manuscripts should be weighed, not counted. Now, really, they do count manuscripts when they're all more of them are on their side, but the idea is that not all manuscripts are created equal. Some manuscripts are older. Some manuscripts have a certain kind of a pedigree that is considered more important. Some manuscripts are related in a group or a cluster of manuscripts that have a common line of descent. And so all these things need to be boiled down. When we look specifically at manuscripts that have the same commentary that accompanies the text, we have text in a manuscript, and then a little bit of commentary, then a little bit more text, and then commentary. That is, there's one particular commentary by Theophylact, and there are 83 manuscripts of Theophylact that do not have John 7:53 through 8:11, but those all go back to the same source, the initial commentary made by Theophylact. And Theophylact is not an ancient writer; he's medieval, basically. So you got to keep in mind that of that 268, some of that boils down quite a bit. So we end up with something like 185, and then you can boil that down a little bit more with 63 other commentary kinds of manuscripts that also omit the passage, and that takes down to about 122. So a simple count doesn't really do justice to the picture that they have. If you look into the weight of the manuscripts, you'll see that a certain amount of those 270 that don't have it, a good slice of that is copies of the same commentary that has the text along with it. Have you ever seen a commentary that has text with it, like the NIV commentary? You know what the text is going to say because it's the NIV. That's where it came from. A person using the NIV was making the commentary, so the NIV text comes with the commentary. Likewise with Theophylact's commentary, unless there's some exceptional cases out there, which there could be somewhere, but as far as I know, Theophylact's commentaries share the same text, and that's why in those cases, in those 83 manuscripts, the text does not have the story of the woman caught in adultery. So when you boil it down, the ratio is not, as it comes out to say you would favor the story of the woman caught in adultery even more if you would take the time to boil down each set of witnesses. Now, when it comes to the manuscripts that don't have the story of the woman caught in adultery, there are some that as I said earlier, that have greater weight than others. Particularly the Alexandrian text line is often given great weight. In fact, back in 1881, the textual critic Hort considered that agreements of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, which both represent the Alexandrian text most of the time, he said it's never safe to reject their reading, and they do not have the story of the woman caught in adultery, and so that's part of the reasoning is why it's been rejected, even before 1881, but especially afterwards. But when it comes to the manuscripts that are given greater weight that don't have the passage, we're basically dealing with about 12 manuscripts in all, but especially this group of 9. Papyrus 66, Papyrus 75, Codex Vaticanus, or B, Codex Sinaiticus, or Aleph, Alexandrinus, which A, Codex C, Codex N, Codex T, and Codex W. It's basically this group where if they had the passage, we wouldn't be talking about it. We just assume, yeah, it's original. There's one other manuscript, and it's not a Greek manuscript, but it also is extremely important. It's the Lycopolitan Qua Codex. I think I'm saying that correctly. It doesn't have text after John 20:27, but it has most of the book of John in it. Now, so the takeaway from that is that if the text was lost, rather than inserted, that loss had to occur before any of those manuscripts were made, which basically means we're dealing with something happening in the 100s. And to get into more detail, I would need to explain what a lection cycle is. A lection is simply a passage of scripture that is set apart to be read on a certain day of the year. And there are two kinds of lectionary cycles, the big major ones, the Synaxarion, which is read from Easter onward, and the Menologion, which is read from New Year's Day. Now, those are what we find in lectionaries. But there are also simple lection cycles where you don't necessarily have a lection assigned to each day, but simply a vague recognition of, okay, it's Christmas time. What are we going to read? Probably something from Luke chapter 2, Matthew chapter 1 and chapter 2. Some texts just naturally get assigned to certain days of the year. And on Pentecost, of course, the Feast of Pentecost, the church had it, as soon as the church started, they were celebrating Pentecost there in Acts chapter 2. So there was some feasts that kind of got transferred from the Old Testament days into the days of the New Testament. But an election cycle is simply a very basic collection of readings assigned to particular days of the year for the major feast days. Now, C.R. Gregory, a textual critic of yesteryear, died in World War I, he proposed that some of the election cycles developed at a very early date. When we look at the writings of Chrysostom and Epiphanius and Augustine, we see references to lections or to reading cycles. We see references to that reading for the day. And we also see, in regard to Easter, that there was some controversy about when are we going to celebrate Easter. In the mid-100s, Polycarp of Smyrna celebrated it on the 14th of Nisan. Anicetus of Rome celebrated it on Sunday, though. Victor of Rome later on said we need to stop celebrating Easter on the 14th of Nisan. Polycrates of Ephesus said, no, we've got apostolic precedent for that, and so that's the point that they had to work out. The thing is to see is that they already had this annual calendar in place. Many churches in America don't really appreciate that the way that, say, a typical Orthodox church would, that are much closer to the lectionary tradition. But once you grasp the concept of certain days have certain passages that you typically read, then this is all got to be a lot more sensible the first time around. In Codex D, probably from the 400s, we see some readings here and there in Mark 14:3, Luke 7:1, Luke 10:1, Luke 16:19. Passages that could be similar to what they would read at the beginning of a lection, because when you have a lectionary or just a single lection, you usually wouldn't just start out with saying, and then he said to them, because your listeners are going to ask, who said that to who? Who's the speaker? And so you would have this introductory phrase. Oftentimes, if Jesus is speaking and you're reading from the Gospels, it would say, and the Lord said to his disciples, or at that time, the Lord spoke to his disciples, something like that. And sometimes there would be a little flourish at the end as well. Well, the person doing the reading in the church, because most people were not literate, and so there was a person who could read and who had a decent voice called the lector. And not too long after the churches started to regularly use scriptures, there would be this office, or rather this function of lector. Origen mentioned lectors in one of his writings. Methodius, a writer of the 200s, 200s. Yeah, Methodius mentions in one of his sermons that this is the sermon for Palm Sunday. So they had this expectation of certain readings on certain days. There's a writing called the Apologia David, probably by Ambrose, and he refers at one point to the title of Psalm 51. And he says, perhaps most people are taken aback by the title of the psalm which you have heard read, that Nathan the prophet came to him after he had gone into Bathsheba. Likewise, those with weak faith could be disturbed by the gospel reading which has been covered, in which we see an adulteress presented to Christ and sent away without condemnation. So there's Ambrose, assuming that it is Ambrose, in the city of Milan, openly referring to this lection, this reading from the Gospels for that day. It's like there is already some sort of lection cycle already in place, and we can't tell how extensive it was. But for Pentecost being one of the main feasts, that would have been one of the first ones to be established. Now, again, it should be clear that I'm making a distinction between lectionaries, which are a later development, and lection cycles. Now, the idea when it comes to John chapter 7, verse 53 through 8:11, is that the Pentecost cycle, the feast being celebrated there in Acts chapter 2, that the idea is that in the 100s, symbols were added to a copy of the Gospel of John to indicate the beginning and end of passages that were designated to be read on the major annual feast days. So this is not a suggestion there was a fully developed lectionary system there in the 100s, but just a very basic, these major feasts, these readings, just like Christmas, Easter, Ascension Day, Pentecost. The major feast had readings assigned to be read on those days. Well, for Pentecost, if we look at the Byzantine lectionary, we see that the Pentecost reading starts at John 7:37. Now that's going to be important. Just keep a note of that, John 7:37. And it ends by going to John 7:52, but it doesn't stop there. It jumps from John 7:52 down to John 8, verse 11. And it closes with John 8:12. So it's John 7:57 through 8:11 plus John 8:12. There are some other passages also that jump like this, but we can focus for now there on Pentecost, the major feast day. You can picture a copyist, a very meticulous, very good copyist, being given a copy of the Gospel of John, and he's told, you're a good copyist, you do what you're told, make a copy of this. And so he sits down to copy the text of the Gospel of John. He comes to his copy. He begins with John chapter 1, verse 1. He proceeds down to chapters 2, 4, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He gets to the Pentecost lection, and it's not too confusing to just see notes that say start and stop. But when he gets to the Pentecost lection, he sees there some notes that are left for the lector. The lector has been instructed in the margin to, when you read the Pentecost lection on Pentecost, don't read the whole thing. After you started at verse 37, of course they didn't have verse numbers, but it's the same thing for us. After you start at verse 37 and you get to the end of verse 52, jump ahead and resume at verse 12 of chapter 8. So he's reading his exemplar, his master copy, and he sees this note on the side at the end of John 7:52 that says, jump ahead. He looks down the page, and there at chapter 8, verse 12, he sees the mark that means resume here. And if you look at manuscripts, if you look at, say, any random 12 manuscripts, you'll see this kind of symbol in the margin. So we see that what would a meticulous, obedient, mechanical scribe, a copyist, do when he sees that there are instructions in his master copy, jump from here and resume down here? That's what he does. He thinks that those instructions are for him. He doesn't realize they're for the lector who's going to be reading the passage on Pentecost. He thinks they're for him, the scribe. And so he does exactly what he thinks he's supposed to do. He jumps from the end of chapter 7, verse 52, down to the beginning of chapter 8, verse 12, and thus he creates a very neat copy of the Gospel of John that is unfortunately missing that entire passage, but he doesn't realize it. And then once his copy, his new exemplar, is used as a master copy by others, just like that, the passage suddenly disappears. And that is the explanation for its loss in the Alexandrian text and some other lines of transmission that are influenced by that. So that's the basic theory that I am proposing. Now, when we look at those manuscripts that I mentioned, it's important to take a close look at that. Some manuscripts say this. For instance, in Codex Delta, which we see here, Codex Delta is a manuscript, not particularly old, but it has an old text with a Latin parallel to it. And the copyist who was making Codex Delta, when he came to John 7:53, he began to write verse 11, but then he realized, wait a minute, I seem to recall something else being here. And we can't read his mind, but we can see what he did. He left this blank space. There, after chapter 7:52, he began to write 8 verse 12 and then stopped, left what is called memorial space. It's not really intended to be something that where you could cram the text into it, but it's simply there to recognize, I recall something being here that isn't here in my master copy. And that's what we have in Codex Delta. So Codex Delta is one of those copies that does not have the story of the woman caught in adultery, but it points two ways, because on the one hand, you have the exemplar, but you also have the memory of the scribe being symbolized by this blank space there at that particular point in the text. Also in Codex L, which is older than Codex Delta, we get a Codex L up there. The Codex L, the copyist did the same thing. The Codex L is a no, that's a different one. Codex L. No, Codex L. But Codex L is a Greek manuscript that is probably about from the 700s, and it too has a blank space there where the story of the woman caught in adultery belongs, and there's even a little doodle in the blank space that there was room for. Are we gonna see that, Ed? Codex L, 019. Okay, well, we'll move along. Maybe we can come back to that later. But we see in yeah, there we go. If you could just enlarge that. Yeah, here we see Codex L, and you see John 7:52, and then it stops. There's this blank space, and then chapter 8, verse 11. Excuse me, chapter 8, verse 12 begins there on the other page with this huge blank space in between, which can only mean one thing. The copyist recollected something that was not in his master copy, and that's the remembrance of it, the memorial that the scribe left for the passage that he recollected. So again, Codex L points both ways. It's listed, of course, as a manuscript that does not have the story of the woman caught in adultery, and yet the copyist of Codex L recollected something is missing here. So it's been mentioned by some that what about why is it in different places? We have an explanation. Simply a copyist, an early copyist in the 100s, misunderstanding lectionary related symbols in his master copy, and just like that, it's gone. But why is it in different places? We saw there in the Christian Standard Bible that it's not just some have it and some don't. Some being about 270, and the other some that have it being about 1,500. But why do those that don't have it in? Excuse me. Why do some of them that have it in different places? And that's what we're going to look into next. James R. White mentioned that in minuscule 225, the pericope adultery is found after John 7:36, and the claim is that this is plain evidence of its later origin. But if we look in this particular manuscript, we see that it's a manuscript that is full of echoes of lectionary related customization. John 13:3-7 in manuscript 225 is also moved around. We find it there in John, but we also find it in the Gospel of Matthew, after Matthew 26, verse 20. This adaptation conforms to a lection cycle, in which a series of lections was annually read at Easter time. All that has happened is that the copyist has made things a little easier for the lector. The Pentecost lection is simply presented all in one piece. When we say it's after 736, why after 736? Because that's the point at which the Pentecost lection begins. That's why it's there. That's why it's not just randomly floating around somewhere. The Pentecost lection begins at John 7:37. What has happened in minuscule 225 is that the copyist has simply made the job of the lector a little bit easier by saying, I'm going to make it so you don't have to stop here and jump down there. We're going to give you all of that lection here at before the Pentecost lection. And when you read for Pentecost, you can read that whole lection continuously. Also, what about John 7:44? Well, how many Greek manuscripts have the story of the adulteress at John 7:44? As far as I know, absolutely none. We're talking about versional manuscripts here, specifically Georgian manuscripts, and we'll get back to this in a minute. But first, we'll look at the Family 1 manuscripts. That is, the manuscripts that have the story of the woman caught in adultery after the end of the Gospel of John, that is, after John 21:25. In Family 1, at least in its two best representatives, probably best, in number 1, manuscript 1, and also in manuscript 1582, this note has survived, and it appears there in John before the story of the woman caught in adultery. And it's important to see this note whenever there's a reference to Oh yeah, it's also after John 21:25. But that's not all that's there. There's also this note that comes before it, and the note is very important. It says the chapter about the adulteress. In the Gospel according to John, this does not appear in the majority of copies, nor is it commented upon by the divine fathers whose interpretations have been preserved, specifically by John Chrysostom and Cyril of Alexandria, nor is it taken up by Theodore of Mopsuestia and the others. For this reason, it was not kept in the place where it is found in a few copies at the beginning of the 86th chapter, that is the 86th Eusebian canon, the 86th Eusebian section, following, search and see that a prophet does not arise out of Galilee. So when we see it at the end of John, we also see a clear, explicit statement to this effect. We didn't find this passage in many copies, but we found it in some. We didn't see it commented on by our favorite cherished commentators. And so we moved it from where we had found it in John at the 86th Eusebian section, which is right where it's usually found, following the phrase, search and see that a prophet does not arise out of there. It was moved from there after 752 to here at the end of John. Now, when you don't see that mentioned, you're just going to think that, wow, it just must be floating around out there like a butterfly, and it just happened to land here at the end of John. But how different is the situation when you're informed about that note? You see, the line of descent is not from out there floating around somewhere in the atmosphere to from the usual place in John to here at the end of John. The note simply says it very plainly. Now let's get back to the Georgian manuscripts that have it at John 7:44. The Georgian text of John, in its earliest stages, did not contain the story of the woman caught in adultery, but the Georgian text was revised later on to make it conform more closely with the Greek manuscripts that dominated at the time. So this note states that the passage has been found at the beginning of the 86th chapter, remember the 86th Eusebian section. Well, when we look at the beginning of the 86th section, we see that's at the beginning of John 7:45. So if you have something right there before that, you can see what's happened. Now, I'm not an expert in Old Georgian, but it doesn't take much to make the deduction that somebody, the person who revised the Georgian text, sees the same note that is in Family 1, sees, oh, this was found at Eusebian section 86, and so that's where he inserts the passage. All that has happened is that the Georgian reviser has inserted the passage where he thought it should go, there at the beginning of the 86th Eusebian section, which begins at John 7:45. So that's where we have the passage in Georgian manuscripts after John 7:44. But we also have this another group of manuscripts, Family 13, which has the pericope adultery at Luke 21:38. And if you continue to, let's bring that on up. Manuscript 13, here's a little picture of this part of the manuscript. This is here in Luke chapter 21, toward the end of chapter 21, because of the same kind of thing that happened in manuscript number 225. It's a lectionary-related transfer of text to a place that was thought to be to make things more convenient for the lector. Saint Pelagia's day. Saint Pelagia was a saint, an early saint, and her feast day was October the 8th. And the reading for Saint Pelagia, by the time things got ironed out, was from John chapter 8, verses 3 through 11. But that wasn't entirely ironed out all at once. That was part the end result of a gradual cycle, and other forms of her lection are varied in different manuscripts. So you could just put the whole thing there, and that could be her lectionary, or her lection. Now, earlier in John, on October 7th, the reading for Saints Sergius and Bacchus is Luke 21, verses 12 through 19. So if you have a copy that's like one of the Family 1 copies, where you have this passage at the end of John, and you think, well, this is the reading for St. Pelagia, we should put it somewhere instead of having it, finding it by surprise all the way at the end. We should put it in a more convenient place. Well, the most convenient place you can put it, because it's the reading for October the 8th, is close to the reading for October the 7th. And that's why we find it here almost as close as possible to where you could put it in a continuous text manuscript after the reading for October 7th, which is Luke 21, 12 through 19. Here you have it at the end of Luke 21 for October the 8th. And by the way, this is not my idea. Previous scholars, F.C. Burkitt, Colwell, Van Lopik, and even Bergen before them, concluded that the transfer in family 13 is the result of lectionary influence. Burkitt, in particular, said that any other explanation is inconceivable. That's the word he used. However, when we take a closer look at it, we can see that the movement is because of lectionary influence, because the influence of whoever moved it from there in John 7 through 8 to the end of John. But when you look at that up close, you might end up thinking it's original. And some people do not want you to think it's original because they like the text of the Alexandrian line. They simply prefer that, and that goes way back. For instance, D.A. Carson is an influential commentator. And one of Carson's statements, if we can pull up Carson. Yes. Yes, it's just an enlarged text. We can all read it. In his Pillar New Testament commentary, and you may have seen this under a different cover, commenting on John 7:53 through 8:11, he says, all the early church fathers omit this narrative. Now, that's not true. I think he left out the word Greek there because there are many early church fathers who use this story. Pacian. He refers to the passage in his third letter to Sympronium, and that's from the late 300s. Ambrose of Milan, also in the 300s. He cites it several times, and he states that it's very widely known, very, very well known. Jerome, working in the 380s on the Gospels, making the Vulgate, he says that he made the Vulgate based on ancient Greek copies. He also affirms in one of his writings that the passage was found in many manuscripts, both Greek and Latin. So if his many is more than 9, then we have as many early manuscripts for it as we do against it. Augustine, working in Africa, and by the way, these are different locations. Pacian's in Spain, Ambrose is in Italy, Jerome's in Bethlehem, Augustine's in Carthage, or near Carthage. Augustine, in his writings, he has this somewhat complex theory of why it's missing in some manuscripts, but he affirms it as original and uses the passage repeatedly. He also mentions that his pagan opponent Faustus used the passage, and he also mentions that there were some other false teachers who made fun of Jesus for writing with his finger on the ground. So there are plenty of references where you can see that there are several early church fathers, Pacian, Ambrose, Jerome, Augustine are some examples, who certainly used and accepted this passage. Also, when it comes to the manuscripts, Daniel Wallace made some claims that continue to be circulated and really should be corrected. Do we have a Daniel Wallace's slide? Yes. Daniel Wallace of Dallas Theological Seminary. Some of you may have seen his textual criticism lessons. At one point, he mentions there's only 3 majuscules, capital letter manuscripts. These are D, K, and Gamma. Those are the only 3 that have it. But in real life, there's a lot more that have it. Now, there's more than 300 uncial manuscripts, but most of them don't have anything from the Gospel of John. Some that have something from the Gospel of John don't have this particular passage, like John chapter. They don't have any of John chapter 7 or John chapter 8. But there are some about. It's pretty evenly divided. You can say that uncials E, G, H, K, M, U, S, G, Omega, 047, 0233 support the passage. Codex F, when it was in pristine condition, by deduction, we can see that it had it. Codex Y doesn't have it, but it has an asterisk that if you think about it hard enough, you can make the deduction that the exemplar of Codex Y had it. And also there's again, Delta and Codex L that point in both directions. So it's not like there's this huge count of uncials that offsets the huge count of minuscules, because the overall count is like, 1,500 versus 270. If it was an election, it would win. So the approach is, let's focus on the uncials. But even when you focus on the uncials, it's about 50-50. with a few toss-up votes kind of in between. But certainly, you cannot validly say that there are only 3 manuscripts that have the story of the woman caught in adultery. It's about half and half. And sometimes we see references to the Old Latin version not having it. Wallace at one point says that when the Syriac and the Coptic and the Latin versions along those lines don't have it, when they were begun in the 2nd and 3rd century, the manuscripts that they used didn't have it. That needs to be considerably modified. We can grant the Syriac and the Coptic, but when it comes to the Old Latin, not so much. We have an Old Latin evidence that wasn't really widely known back in the 1800s, but it was analyzed very carefully, and we can see that in the Old Latin manuscripts, and by Old Latin I mean Old Latin copies are copies that are in Latin, usually with a Western form of the text, and they often have what's called what's called the capitula, a capitula before each chapter, a brief summary of the chapter. And in the chapter summaries, we see references to the woman caught in adultery. They might not be very lengthy references, but they don't need to be. They're supposed to be summaries. And we see in one of the earliest forms of the Old Latin capitula a reference to the woman caught in adultery. And could we see that slide? I think we saw it momentarily earlier. Nope, other one. It's in Latin. Nope, other one. It's the old Latin capitula. But the idea is that the copies, yes, there we go. And at my website, I have links to this manuscript and descriptions of the manuscript in detail. But the basic idea is that you can kind of see the word. If you look at the second word, there you see the word adulteram, where Jesus dismissed the adulteress, and then he talked about himself being the light of the world, and testified, and so forth. We see this chapter summary for the Old Latin text, and this particular form of the capitula was preserved in later manuscripts. The manuscripts themselves might have the Vulgate text, but the supplemental materials, like the capitula, chapter summaries, was taken from an Old Latin text. And so the capitula survive even when at a time when the Vulgate text is dominant. How old is the Old Latin capitula that we're looking at here? It's estimated to go back to the time of Cyprian or shortly thereafter, which would be in the 200s. That's pretty early for a manuscript of any kind. Again, these aren't manuscripts, but they're echoing a source from the 200s. So that's important evidence. And to say, well, the Old Latin doesn't have it, you have various forms of these capitula, and if you look through them, and again, the links to the various listings of readings are all there at the website. The Old Latin capitula clearly had the passage because it's there in the chapter summaries. It was there to summarize. So again, there's various pieces of misinformation floating about, like the old writers don't use it. No, actually, lots of the old writers use it. And there's passages that say, well, the old manuscripts don't have it. Well, yeah, 9 of them don't have it. The Alexandrian text doesn't have it. We have some branches of the Byzantine text that were influenced by the Alexandrian text a little bit that don't have it, or that were influenced by the Caesarean text. Codex N would be one of the main ones. But most of the Byzantine manuscripts most certainly have it. And I've already listed some of those, such as Codex K. Now, at one point, Wallace claims that in some manuscripts it stands, that is, the story of the woman caught in adultery stands as an independent pericope between Luke and John. And the manuscript he's talking about is manuscript 1333. It's not a particularly old manuscript, but in manuscript 1333, we see part of the story of the woman caught in adultery. We don't see the whole passage, and I don't think that Wallace ever points that out. Something else that Wallace does not point out is the titles, the labels of the passage that are clearly there on the page. If we can zoom in on the very top of that. Let's just zoom in. Yeah, there we go. We don't have John 7:53 through 8:11 here. We have John 8:3 through 11. What we have here is the pericope, the lection for St. Pelagia's Day for October the 8th in a normal Byzantine Menologion. And if you look at the top, you'll see this is the reading for October the 8th. Then in the middle, you can see the word octo, abbreviation. And then at the right, in Greek, there at the very top, on the right, this is for St. Pelagia. But also, in the first column, on the second line, you see the word ek. Next word is tau. Next word is kata. And then you see a iota and an omega, and that's an abbreviation for John. So what we have here is a label that says from the gospel. The little gospel's not there, but that would be implied. According to John. So very plainly, in 1333, we don't have this, gee, I wonder where it came from. Was it floating around out there? No. It says it right there on the page. This is from the gospel according to John. Like you would see in many lectionaries, that's how it's presented here on the page. What has happened is that manuscript 1333 initially was made without the story of the woman caught in adultery, but somebody at some point wanted to use it to read lections from it. And so, because he didn't want to just shrug on October the 8th, he took the blank page between the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John that just happened to be there and filled it up with John chapter 8, verses 3 through 11. That's what we have here in manuscript 1333. It's not just floating around out there, and it has a perfectly reasonable explanation for why it's there. Also in a manuscript 115, Wallace makes an extremely improbable theory about saying you can see why the scribe wrote verse 8 there, wrote verse 12 there twice. His theory is just wrong. The copyist of 115 was making the lector's job a little bit easier by formatting the Pentecost lection as one continuous reading, like what we saw in 225. Manuscript 115 is not the only manuscript that does that. The same thing is found in minuscules 1050, 1349, and 2620. And in minuscule 476, John 8:12 is written in the margin alongside 752 for the same purpose. This copyist is simply making things easier for the lector, the person that's going to be reading the passage on Pentecost. Wallace at one point also says, I told you that some of the manuscripts have an asterisk here, or have an asterisk there, and the asterisk is indicating that the text is not authentic. Here in Codex 1424, we see asterisks in the margin down here of this text. So you've got the text actually written out, but then you've got the asterisk saying it's not authentic, or that they have doubts about it. And significantly, those asterisks say the scribe is telling us he has doubts about the authenticity. That's how Dr. Wallace has presented manuscript 1424. But if you take a quick look at 1424 and look at the manuscript up close, now 1424 is a significant manuscript. It was at Chicago for a long time, and then it was returned to its owners across the sea. But if we were to zoom in on 1424 and see the note that you'll notice Dr. Wallace, I don't think he describes the note in detail, but there at the top you see part of it there. And if we could just make it a little bit bigger, we could read the text. But the text is from John. It's the story of the woman caught in adultery. You can see on the side there are the asterisks. If you move it a little bit to the left, they're the asterisks. But then look a little farther down, and you'll see something else. A note. Well, not that far down. But yeah, okay. Wait, well, yeah, okay. The note says, this is not in certain copies, and it was not in those used by Apollinaris. In the old ones, it is all there. I repeat, something you might have missed in Dr. Wallace's lecture. The note in 1424 says, the story of the woman caught in adultery is all there in the old copies. And this pericope is referenced by the apostles, affirming that it is for the edification of the church. Does that sound like something that would be said by somebody who's writing, say, I have doubts about this, maybe you shouldn't use this? Does that sound anything remotely like what the scribe is in the real world trying to say when he says, this is completely there in the old copies, and it's referenced by the apostles for the edification of the church. Now, that last sentence there where it says it's for the edification of the church, that's a reference to another early writing, the Apostolic Constitutions, which is from about the year 380. And there in the Apostolic Constitutions, Book 2, Chapter 24, which is modeled upon an older work, the Didascalia, there's the reference to the story of the woman caught in adultery in the year 380. That's what this note is referring to. Now, it's not really from the apostles, but he thinks it is. And so that's why he writes this note. The same note is in manuscript 1187. In manuscript 1187, we see the same note at the bottom of the page. If we did zoom in down there at the bottom of the page, wait, yeah. Here's the story with obli by it, and there at the bottom, the obliged portion and so forth, like the other note. So we see this note is not just an independent scribe just spontaneously saying this, but this note is a catena, a note that's older than the person that wrote it. Now again, going back to the patristic writers, Jerome, and Against the Pelagians, chapter 2, book 2, verse 17, part 17, he says, in the Gospel of John, there is found in many of the Greek, as well as the Latin copies, the story of the adulteress who was accused before the Lord. This is Jerome writing no later than 420, because after that he's dead. So this is an early writer saying that in copies that were early to him, he found the story of the woman caught in adultery. And he found it, in this reference, he found it in Greek copies and in Latin copies. Now, there are reasons if you just look at it from a distance. If you never clarify, that sum, if you keep the footnote nice and vague, so you don't see the count of the manuscripts, you don't see anything about the old Latin capitula, you don't see anything about the early quotations of the passage. If all you see is some manuscripts and some don't, of course you're going to be wondering. Of course it's going to remain in doubt. But when you look at the evidence up close, you look at the old Latin capitula, you look at some of Ambrose's wording that seems to echo an earlier Greek form of the text, when you see how much territory this passage covers in the early church, from Spain to Italy to where Jerome is. And we probably, when Jerome says he saw this passage, he's possibly referring to manuscripts that he saw when he visited Didymus in Egypt. Didymus also references a story of an adulteress, or a story of a woman caught in her sins. And Didymus says that he found it in some Gospels. Now, Didymus was blind from his early childhood. And some scholars have said, well, it just says Gospels. That doesn't mean the four Gospels. But the Gospels was a normal way of referring to a copy of the four Gospels, a book that you could hold in your hand that had the four Gospels. You would naturally refer it to the four Gospels, and there was no reason to be specific because there was only one Gospel in the Gospels that it was in. That was the Gospel of John. So if it had been in any Gospel out there floating around as part of some other book, the tendency, the natural thing to do would be to specify what Gospel you saw it in. Was it this Gospel of somebody else? By calling it, by saying it was in the Gospels, the natural understanding would be that it was in the four Gospels, which would refer to John because it's not in any of the others. So, well, in Family 13, it's in Luke, but that's Family 13. So I think that wraps up my presentation of the evidence for why it was lost and why it has moved around. And I think we can open up the discussion for questions. Sam?
1 second, bro. Now, before I hold on, Ed, you stick around. Did you have another part to the discussion you want to unpack?
If I could just kind of combine that with questions and answers, there's more to cover, but I want to speak about what people are interested in most, and so I have
Let me ask, brethren. There's another part to discussion now. Just to let you know their reaction, Brother James, they're blown away. I'm sorry, I was trying to share my screen with you, but I couldn't. but they're blown away. They are astounded at the level of misinformation that's out there. I've been reading comments. Why then would people like Wallace and Carson and White not tell us these things or keep these facts from us? They are blown away, and they're blessed because people are now rejoicing that the evidence is overwhelming in support of the story, because they love the story. They've always believed it's God-breathed scripture. It's a true event in the life of Jesus. So they're happy that God has raised up someone like you to give them this side, but they're also upset. Why do these scholars then misinform us so badly? What would you say to that?
Well, I've tried to pick out some of the more major league scholars like Carson and Wallace. Those are influential writers, influential speakers, and the reason why I focused on them wasn't just to pick on them, but to show you that, you know, if this is how it is, you know, to kind of paraphrase, this is what it's like when the tree is green. What happens when it's dry?
Yeah.
And likewise, if this is what happens to the scholar that has the theological library right next door, what's going to happen to the preacher in his church that, well, he just, you know, turns on YouTube and sees a video and says, yeah, that sounds reasonable. The person that never sees the other side of the story, or what happens to the person that looks in his Bible footnote that just says, like you saw in the Christian Standard Bible, where it says, well, some manuscripts have it here, some have it here, some have it here, some have it here, and it's all very vague and nebulous, and it's impossible for the reader that doesn't take the time to do the digging, which is kind of what the footnote writers are supposed to do, but they make it impossible to see from the footnote the degree of how many manuscripts favor the inclusion, and also the antiquity of the age of the testimony back in the Old Latin, back in the early church writings, and so forth. Yeah. So, but part of the reading isn't just the fault of writers and speakers like James White or Daniel Wallace, but a lot of them are simply repeating what they read in this book. This is the textual commentary on the Greek New Testament by Bruce Metzger. And in Metzger's treatment of this passage, he leaves out quite a bit of some of the more important pieces of evidence that I presented. When you look in Metzger's comments, Metzger comes across very confident. He says, well, the evidence is overwhelming. And that's the term that he uses. The evidence is overwhelming. To quote, the evidence for the non-Johannine origin of the pericope of the adulteress is overwhelming. It's absent from such early and diverse manuscripts as P66, 75, the ones that I listed before, but also Thetis, 0041, and you list others like 2022, 3033, 157, and so forth. And he also would say, well, you don't see it in the early versions, and there again, that's why I bring up the Old Latin version, capitula, so you can see in the Old Latin a very early time of Cyprian or slightly later, you can draw that deduction. And so he also says no Greek church father prior to Euthemius Zigabinus, which is from like the 1100s, comments on the passage. Now really, if you would take the time and look into the writings of Pseudo Rhetor, and again, details of this are in my book, where a bishop named Mera, also known as Mora, is mentioned, who comes across a copy of the Gospel of John and finds a story like this in the manuscript that he has from about the 600s or so. So Metzger's comment on that is simply not true. And there's other modifications that need to be made to Metzger's comments as well. Quite a bit of Metzger's comments could stand to be revised, but because this book has been such a standard handbook, that nobody seems to be in a hurry to fix it. Nobody seems to be in a hurry to say, well, he's wrong here, he's wrong here, he's wrong here, and that's very inaccurate, and that's going to mislead people, but we like his conclusion, and so we won't worry about it. So that's part of the reason, because so many people, if you read commentaries, you can see oftentimes, if you hold up commentary A and this textual commentary, you can see that the commentator has not done independent work. He is simply writing mainly to exegete the text. And when it comes to text critical questions, he picks up Metzger and says, Metzger, tell me what I should tell my readers, and I'll rephrase it. In the course of rephrasing Metzger, many of Metzger's claims often get yeasted, stretched, to the point of becoming even more inaccurate than they already were.
And one more, and then you have the make the positive case. You have another section where you're going to make the positive case for the story of the adulteress, right? So there's a part 2 right now coming right after this. So one thing, the reason why I mentioned these names, and again, I mentioned this name, I don't want people to think I have any ill will. He's a brother. I consider him a friend, even though in the past we've had some differences. And I know he's not too happy with the course I'm taking now. The reason why James White comes up is because, fortunately or unfortunately, his book, The King James Only Controversy, has become quite a popular book among lay audiences, much like Bart Ehrman. And by the way, I'm not saying James White's book does what Bart Ehrman's book does, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, but Bart Ehrman also wrote a book on textual criticism that became quite popular among unbelievers, whereas James White's book, The King James Only Controversy, became popular among believers. But a lot of stuff he said there was based on his ignorance of the issues. And I'm not saying I'm more knowledgeable on him. I know he's ignorant because of people like James Snapp, thank the Lord for them, balancing it out, and misinformation. And so it's caused a lot of doubt. And I say that because his book, I'm sure many of you have read it and you thought the world of it. But again, I say this because you are an expert. And I thank God for you. You have studied all the issues, and you have invited, for the record, he's invited Daniel Wallace, James White, and others to discuss with him as brothers. He doesn't consider them enemies or Muslims or Hindus. Brothers, let's discuss this. Let's have a friendly, brotherly discussion. They have refused to discuss it with him. In fact, I have it on good record, and I want this recorded. I want James White to hear this because this disappointed me and my brother. James White told a so-called Christian scholar, and I got this on solid authority, and if I have to bring them as witnesses, I will. James White told a Christian so-called scholar, don't debate James Snapp on these issues. Why not? Why wouldn't you want this brother, James Snapp, to engage you, James White, and Daniel Wallace, so that people can hear all sides? You make your best case, he makes his best case, and then we decide. Why would you encourage people not to engage him in a brotherly debate when you're all for brotherly debate? Why would you want to hide this information from folks like me who for years doubted the authenticity of the story? So I want your honest assessment. What is your honest assessment of King James Only controversy?
Well, I have some comments on my blog, and if you have I think if you can pull up the link that I put up to PA Subbooks HTML. If you go to www.curtisvillecc.com and go there and hunt down just go to the buttons on that homepage and click on the buttons to resources for New Testament textual criticism. One of them will, if you scroll down a bit, you'll see a button that says resources for John 7:53 through 8:11, and on that page there's another button. There's lots of buttons, but there's a button specially focused on some of the claims and some of the questions that James White has had. Those questions are specifically answered. For instance, when James White says manuscript 225 moves this around, why does it do that? Because it was floating around like a butterfly? No, James. 225 is a kind of a hybrid manuscript, part continuous text, but part lectionary. And we see, in Family 13, we see other passages moved around. For instance, we see Luke chapter 22, verses 43 through 44. In Family 13, that passage is also moved around. Just like we see the story of the woman caught in adultery at the end of Luke 21, we see the story of the angel in the garden moved over to Matthew chapter 26, between verses 39 and 26, verse 40. So that's simply lectionary influence. That's where somebody has prepared a text to be read as a lection, and they want to make sure they catch it all, but not in a lectionary, but in this manuscript which is mainly formatted as a continuous text manuscript. That's basically what you've got in a lot of Family 13. But when you don't realize that, you can easily make the assumption, plus by reading guys like Metzger, the assumption that it's been floating around. if you don't look into the note of they're in detail in Family 1, you could easily make the natural assumption. And it's understandable how these mistakes are made. But when you dig deeper and look into it, you can say, well, yeah, I guess there's really no real evidence that it was ever floating around as a floating anecdote, even though that's the impression that you would get from Metzger, and then secondary as an echo of Metzger, you get it from Wallace, and as an echo of Wallace, you get it from somebody else. So when the groupthink stops and people take a step back and look at the evidence without a pre-drawn assumption, like the assumptions that we've seen in the critical text ever since 1881, the assumptions like what Hort said, where Hort said, well, whenever Sinaiticus and Vaticanus agree, it's never safe to say they're wrong. That was part of Hort's approach, and you can look in his introduction and see that statement clearly. Now Hort clearly overestimated the weight of those agreements. There's an agreement, for instance, in Matthew 7, in Matthew 27:49, where Vaticanus and Sinaiticus both agree that there should be a passage in the Gospel of Matthew that says that Jesus was killed by a spear, whereas, of course, in the Gospel of John, that's not what it says. It says that Jesus was already dead, and the soldiers are checking up on, you sure he's dead? Longinus, I think we better check. And so he's speared then, and blood and water flow forth. In Matthew 27:49, and those two major manuscripts of the Alexandrian text, that's when it happens, before he dies. So people need to ask themselves, how much do you trust Alexandrinus? Excuse me, how much do you trust Sinaiticus and Vaticanus? Do you trust them enough that you're going to put in a passage that they have that makes Matthew contradict John? Now, Hort was probably willing to do that, but I don't think Daniel Wallace or some other scholars or James White would be willing to do that. There's a case to be made, an entirely objective case, a disinterested case, without having inerrancy on the equation. But clearly, the question of inerrancy is going to be on the radar, because people are going to wonder, wait a minute, you're telling me that a textual variant can affect a doctrine? Because we're often told textual variants never affect doctrines. And but when you read the fine print, you'll see words where, well, it's not all textual variants, because you take a manuscript like the old Latin Codex K, Babiensis, there are clearly some readings in there that are kind of just loopy. Some of them just make no sense. And if they were adopted into the text, you would have, well, nonsensical readings in your text. But they also have to be viable. They have to have enough weight to them. It's not just, well, that is got to be the worst scribe ever. But all we're learning from this is that scribe could barely write. What we're dealing with is an illiterate scribe, not a variant that could be original. So when you push aside the variants that are not viable, because it's just an incompetent scribe making them, then you look at the manuscripts that have more weight, and that's where you get into the readings that you seriously consider, that says, well, yeah, there's a chance this could be original. But there too, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus do have some readings that pose problems for the doctrine of inerrancy. Now if you were to say, well, okay, well, we're going to stretch it a little bit more, when you really zoom in on it, textual variants don't affect any essential doctrine. It might affect a peripheral doctrine, but it doesn't affect the essential doctrines. Well, what's the essential doctrine? Who gets to say which doctrines are essential? Who gets to do that picking and choosing? Is inerrancy an essential doctrine? Look at the Dallas Theological Seminary's website, and it certainly does look to me like the website of Dallas Theological Seminary, where Dr. Wallace teaches. It says that inerrancy is one of 7 essentials that the school upholds. But if you look at the fine print, Dr. Wallace will probably tell you, I think if you look on his blog, you can see the statement, that, well, that's a peripheral doctrine. So it kind of depends on who you ask of whether it affects any of the essential doctrine, because some doctrines to some people are not essential, whereas others would say they are.
Ah, boy.
Speaking of reading in Matthew chapter 13, I believe it's in verse 35, where Matthew quotes from Psalm 72, which is by Asaph, and Codex Sinaiticus, it says, as Isaiah says. Now, what we're probably dealing with here is simply a tendency of copyists back in the old days to do what paraphrases do in the new days. Because if you look at paraphrases like the Message, when the Old Testament is quoted, oftentimes the paraphrase will just throw in which specific book it's quoted from. Like when there's a quotation from Deuteronomy, Eugene Peterson just threw in the word, it's from Deuteronomy, or it's from this book, or that book. And copyists back then wanted to know which book it was from too. In other words, there was a tendency to make the text more specific. We see this in Mark 1, verse 2 as well, a tendency to make the text more specific. We see the reference that says, in the prophets, or in Isaiah the prophet. Well, when you look at the text itself, it's a little bit of Isaiah, but it's also Malachi. It kind of leads with the other one. So should we say in the prophets, which is in most manuscripts? I mean, and I don't mean most like 51%. I mean most like more than 98%. The Greek transmission line that says in Isaiah is narrow. When we look at the manuscripts that say, in the prophets, it's very broad. So in terms of simple number, in the prophets is overwhelming. But again, you can't count the manuscripts. You need to weigh them. And so here the pro-Alexandrian school of thought would say, well, the Alexandrian manuscripts, even if it's just Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, can outweigh everything else. And we see this principle in play at various points in the Nestle-Allen compilation. We see them, the compilers, that is. We see this very heavy dependence upon B, which is Vaticanus, and Aleph, which is Sinaiticus. Sometimes there are readings that where they are adopted, almost everything else is rejected. For instance, in Mark 9:29, there's another case where Jesus says, this kind of demon can't go out except by prayer and fasting. Or does he? Because in Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, he just says, except by prayer. And there's a few other manuscripts that also have just prayer without and fasting. Well, we're always being told, no, what about the early manuscripts? Those are the ones that really count, right? Well, look back at Papyrus 45, and if you carefully reconstruct the text, the space considerations make it very probable that Papyrus 45 has and fasting. So if you have and fasting favored by the oldest witness, and you have and fasting favored in a quotation from Origen might be quoting from Matthew 18:11, or he might be quoting from Mark 9:29, but he's got to be quoting from one of them. If you take out both of them, because the Alexandrian text doesn't have Matthew 18:11 in it, and you take out the reference to and fasting here, then this is a reading that definitely influences what a person is going to think about the question of, if I am preparing for an exorcism, not that a whole lot of people are likely to do that, but if the situation would arise, should I fast? Well, not in the Alexandrian text, because the Alexandrian text, that element of fasting is not there. And again, online on my blog, I have like four blogs about this particular subject of Mark chapter 1 and how fasting was treated in the early church. But in Matthew 13:35, in Mark 1 verse 2, in Matthew 18:11, also in Mark 6:22, where it simply looks like a historical contradiction is being drawn by Mark, where when you compare Mark to Matthew, whose daughter was that danced? Oh, Matthew, it's clearly the daughter of Herodias. Herodias being the ex-wife of Herod's brother, like John the Baptist said. She's not Herod's daughter, she's Herodias' daughter. But if you look in the Alexandrian text, in a smattering of manuscripts, you'll see the reference to, she's Herod's daughter. Now, is it hard to see how that reading could have arisen simply by a copying glitch? Because many times we see copyists just making simple, careless mistakes. We're not trying to change the text. They just change it by accident. They skip a line, they repeat a line, they just lose their place, and then they try to salvage it the best they can. We see this in many cases, and I think that's what we have here in Mark chapter 6, verse 22. But oftentimes, when textual critics will use another principle, and that is the principle of prefer the more difficult reading. Because the idea is that copyists tended not to try to make the text more complicated and harder to understand. The tendency of scribes in the Western line of transmission was to make the text easier to understand. If you have a passage that says, he said to him, the Western text will be the text form most likely to say, Jesus said to Peter, to fill in the blanks, not really changing the meaning, but making the meaning more explicit, to clarify the meaning. That's what the Western text tended to do. Now, in Hort's model of transmission, the Byzantine text was not an independent text at the beginning of its existence. It began, according to Hort, in the late 200s, maybe early 300s, but probably early 200s, as somebody who says, I think we should make a new text. Let's get some Alexandrian manuscripts. Let's get some Western manuscripts, put them together, and we'll go case by case down the list, make a new text, and that'll be a new standard text. And so the idea is that the Byzantine text was created out of Alexandrian and Western manuscripts. That's Hort's fundamental theory. Based on that premise, Hort then went on to extrapolate all of the Byzantine readings. Now, he called them Syrian readings, but it's the same thing. All the virtually the same thing. All of the Byzantine readings can be dismissed. So that's why Hort tended to favor the Alexandrian text. He rejected the Byzantine text because he said, well, that was made in the late 200s. Therefore, anything unique in it can't be original. So if we're going to look for the original text, we have to look at either the Alexandrian or the Western. Hort went one step further and said, well, the Western is constantly embellished and paraphrased. The only really accurate text is the Alexandrian text. And even though the Alexandrian text was really well represented in Hort's time by Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, Hort's theory was those two manuscripts are the manuscripts we have to go on. George Salmon, in 1890, another Greek scholar, he kind of looked at Hort's approach and analyzed it to say, well, this kind of reminds me of something that was said by the old Roman writer Cato, when somebody asked him, what's the best way to make a living? And Cato would say, well, raising crops. And somebody said, well, but I'm trying to recollect it exactly here. Oh, yeah. And somebody said, well, what's the best way to make even more money? And Cato would say, raising crops. And somebody said, what's the best way to really be a pillar of the community and build up your community? Cato would say, raising crops. And somebody would say, well, what's the best way to make a great legacy for your family? And Cato would say, raising crops. And somebody said, but Cato, what about banking? And Cato said, what about killing a man? Salmon said that Hort sounded like that. His primary position was follow Vaticanus and follow Sinaiticus when they agree. If they disagree, follow Vaticanus. If Vaticanus just isn't there, like after Hebrews 9:14 because of damage, then follow Sinaiticus. What about the Western reading? What about killing a man? Hort virtually never accepted any reading except the Alexandrian reading because of his model of transmission that he had built, with one exception. In cases where the Western text was shorter, where it did the opposite of what it usually did, where it was shorter than the other kinds of manuscripts, it was shorter than the Byzantine text, it was shorter than the Alexandrian text. At those points, particularly in Luke 24, at those points, Hort said, we kind of want to call the Alexandrian text the text of Vaticanus. We want to call that the neutral text, except for these spots over here in Luke 24. Well, Hort didn't want to call these things neutral corruptions because that's a contradiction in terms. So instead, he came up with a new term. He called them Western non-interpolations. In other words, places in the Western text that have not been interpolated, but all the other texts have been. And so, in the 1881 Greek text by Westcott and Hort. That's why we see the Western text, where it's shorter, being favored in Luke 24. That's something that influenced translations later on. If you look at the early editions of the Revised Standard Version and look for some of those verses in Luke 24, you won't see them because of Hort's theory. Now, later on, when Papyrus 75 was discovered, they looked at Papyrus 75 and said, well, oops. And next translation, we see those verses pop back in because of the influence of Papyrus 75. But the whole thing is turning on a very small channel of transmission. And that's a concern, because when you have things turning on a very channel of transmission, you get quirks happening, like you see in the NIV in Mark chapter 1, verse 41, where, look at 99% of the manuscripts, and it says Jesus was filled with compassion, which makes sense. It doesn't raise a question. It's natural to say, but all these same considerations work in the opposite direction to favor the reading that's in the Western text, where it says Jesus was angry. Exactly. Or in the NIV, it waters it down a little bit, but really it's just angry. Jesus was indignant. He was angry with this leper coming to him and says, if you can heal, if you will, you can make me clean. In Codex Bezae, one Greek manuscript, it says, and Jesus, being indignant, turned to him and it proceeds from there. But why is Jesus angry? And this is the point that Bob Ehrman tries to make a case for this. I don't think it's a plausible case, because there were synonyms in those days in Syriac where the phrase for the word for angry and filled with compassion looked almost exactly the same. It'd be very easy to mistake one for the other. Kind of like in some languages in Papua New Guinea, I think they've had the same problem of somebody saying he is warm-hearted, but somebody else taking the same phrase and saying he's hot-headed. Almost the same, but not quite the same. And when you translate it, it's very, very different regarding its sense. That's what we have going on in the world's most corrupt manuscript, which is Codex Bezae. But because it's the more difficult manuscript, because it's nonsense, they favor that reading. And that's why in the new NIV, not the NIV made by that huge committee of scholars, but the small NIV made by a select cabal of, 15 guys when they all happen to show up, half of who are New Testament, and half of who just to kind of sit back and let the New Testament guys do their thing. That's where the NIV's crazy reading in Mark 1:41 comes from, because of the narrowness of the transmission line. Now, one way to avoid those kinds of quirks is to look at the broader transmission line, which you will, and if you follow the broader transmission line, also considering its earliest forms, like what we see in Codex K, Family Pi, and the patristic evidence, when you put those things together, you get a text that tends to be more like the Byzantine text. Not entirely, but a lot like the Byzantine text that you see printed by, let's see, just a moment.
When he finished this, he's going to have the positive presentation. So, guys, don't leave. You hear him out carefully. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think I've got to put over there somewhere. But Robinson, the Robinson Pierpont Byzantine text, that tends to be very much different from the critical text of Westcott and Hort, but also has a much broader channel of transmission behind every single reading in the text. Getting back to the story of the woman caught in adultery, one of the exceptions where we don't have a tight majority is in the story of the woman caught in adultery. At that point in Robinson's text, I'm still looking for it. It has disappeared from the face of the earth. But at that point in Robinson's text, you'll see two forms of the story of the woman caught in adultery, because that's what we see in the manuscripts. Not just those two. Von Soden, a scholar from the early 1900s, he proposed that there were 7 forms. You can probably get away with boiling those down to 3, but even then, when you have a 3-way split, you might not always have a majority. You might have when the simple count is close. And when it comes to the internal evidence, if we can look at that now, the internal evidence for the story.
Before you do that, now you're going to start the positive case.
Yeah, this is part of it.
Okay. So I want to bring Ed. I've been listening. I'm sorry, guys. I didn't mean to cut him off. I apologize. He's not going to give you the positive case that John 7 is genuine scripture. I thought you were still answering my question. I apologize. I'm going to recede. Do you still need Ed, James?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, we're going to go back. Guys, listen attentively. The massive amount of evidence for its genuineness and the assumptions that scholars bring, why they question it. Go ahead, brother. Sorry.
Well, most of the case that Metzger brings against it is based on the external evidence. But when you take a closer look at the external evidence, you don't see the passage actually floating around the way that Metzger and the echoes and parrots of Metzger have presented it as being. When you look at the external evidence, you see it being there very early. You see it there being there in a number of locales. So the scope factor weighs in favor of the passage. But some people have objected to the inclusion of the passage on internal grounds. For instance, there was a lot of vocabulary variation in this passage. Even when you look in Robinson's Byzantine text, you'll see one form here and one form here represented. Part of the reason for that has to do, I think, and this again is presented in more detail in my book, is what about that passage that Eusebius mentions as having been written by Papias about a woman who was taken in many sins. Now, some people think that, well, maybe that's a reference to the story of the woman caught in adultery, but I would argue instead that that's an account of a woman caught in sins of some sort, and that particular story was preserved right on into the 400s when the Armenian text was made, and it was still circulating in Armenia later on when a particularly significant Armenian manuscript was made. I believe it was F.C. Burkitt who made a translation of this in one of his essays, but he clearly showed that there were two forms of the story circulating, kind of competing. And when we look at Codex Beza, for instance, we don't see the same fixed form of the passage. It's as if in the transmission line where the passage was lost, at some point somebody realized, hey, wait a minute, there's something missing here, and said, well, we don't have any other manuscripts to fix it with. All the manuscripts are from the same transmission line. What do you suggest we do? Somebody else says, wait a minute, isn't the same story that Papias told about? Well, Eusebius mentions it. And so they take the story from Papias, and that's what we see in this second form that we see in the Armenian manuscript. That's where we see the story of the woman taken in many sins. This could be a manuscript like what we see in Mara, which is the pseudo-rector reference. And again, the details can get pretty complicated. That's why I wrote a book about it. So if you look in my book, and you can get it for free at the NT Textual Criticism transmission group. Excuse me, back up. If you go to the NT Textual Criticism discussion group on Facebook, you can find in the files there a copy of my book on John 7:53 through 8:11. Download that, take it away for free. Distribute at will. Or if you go to Amazon and you want it in form for a Kindle, because Amazon doesn't give things away for free very often, it's there on Amazon for 99 cents, and you can read it on a Kindle or with the Kindle app. In the book, I go into detail about how there could be a story by Papias that's circulating at the same time as the Gospel of John is being spread around early Christianity. After John 7:53 through 8:11 is lost because of the quirk in the lectionary, later on somebody says, well, we should replace that, but they can't. What they can do is, we'll put in a proxy. We'll put in this other story that makes the same point from Papias's 5 books on the sayings of the Lord. And so you have these two texts in competition. Sometimes a copy of John comes along and says, oh, we'll fix it. And most of it gets fixed. Most of the proxy gets taken away, but not quite all of it. There's a few things in the proxy that they kind of like. And so those things they retain in the text. The trickle of readings from the story preserved in papyrus has this effect on the text of the passage in the Gospel of John of having this wave of variation from papyrus. So the whole story of papyrus doesn't survive because it's only preserved because it resembles the story that was in John. But that's where you get a lot of the variation in the vocabulary. Another point about vocabulary is that when we look at the text and we say, well, this vocabulary looks very non-Johannine, which form are we using? The family one form of the text is not the majority text, but it is clearly a very ancient form of the text. For instance, it's often objected, John never uses the word scribes when he's talking about the religious leaders. Well, in family one, look at the text. You see the word scribes there? No? Well, there goes the objection. So if you look at the family one text and make a reasonable critical analysis of the whole passage, there's a lot fewer of those vocabulary-based objections at the end of the day than just starting out with a commentator who's using the Alexandrian form of the text or a late Alexandrian form of the text as his basis. So when it comes to internal evidence that's based on vocabulary, yeah, there's a reason for that. Also, the question of doesn't this passage disrupt the flow of the narrative comes up. I think Gordon Fee has tried to make this point repeatedly. Well, when we look at the structure of John's flow in this part of the Gospel of John, we see in the previous scenario, the religious leaders are having their own private discussion. They're not talking in Jesus' presence right in front of him. They're asking the guards who have come to them, why don't you have him? Where's Jesus? Didn't we send you to fetch him? And they say, man never spoke like this man. At least that's what they say in the Byzantine text. And after that, we turn to the scene where everybody goes home to their house. Then the next day in the morning, Jesus teaches the multitudes, and that's where that's where the adultery shows up. So we have this clear, step one, step two, step three. Here the Pharisees are off by themselves. Then they show up with the adulteress, so they're on the scene there. Take that out and ask yourself, when you look at that, when do the Pharisees enter the scene? Because without the story of the woman caught in adultery, they just seem to show up out of nowhere. It's like 1 second in John 7, they're in their own private conference, and the next second they're talking to Jesus. And you could say, well, this is just John introducing them out of the blue, but it seems more natural of John, contra fee, to simply say they're there with Jesus on the scene with the adulteress. So when it comes to doesn't it disrupt the narrative, I would say it's the exact opposite. It's without the story of the woman caught in adultery that you have an internal problem. Where do the Pharisees come from? So also, if you look at John 7:53, just to restate all of that, because I kind of got a prepared statement here about that. The problem is bad for the form of the text that's missing John 7:53 through 8:11. The Pharisees are then last seen in 7:52 at a conference by themselves, and thus cannot be present to interact with Jesus in the temple 2 verses later. Nothing but a determination to squint a problem into existence requires anyone to imagine the Pharisees who brought the adulteress to Jesus and subsequently departed were the only Pharisees in the temple that day, as if no other Pharisees could be in the crowd. So you could say the Pharisees are just other Pharisees, but you don't really have John saying this. So the passage is just as disrupted without as it would be with. In fact, I would say less disrupted with the passage in the text. Now, there is a complicated position that Fee kind of stakes out, where he says, well, on that day of the feast, they were having this elaborate ceremony with the waters, the offering of waters, and the lights there in the temple. And then, so when Jesus says, I am the light of the world, it's in response to this ceremony. The thing is, John never mentions any of that, does he? It's like John doesn't expect his readers in Ephesus, not in Jerusalem. He doesn't assume that his readers in Ephesus are going to know about Jerusalem, especially if he's writing after the destruction of Jerusalem. He doesn't. There's nothing in the text that would say, all this elaborate ceremony is in the minds of John readers, and he expects that to be what they're thinking about. He's simply writing a clear, coherent, step-by-step description of what happened, because it happened that way, not to fit in with its elaborate illustration. So I think that's really if there are any other internal considerations that would draw the passage into question, I'd be welcome to consider. I can't really read the minds of whatever anybody might think about that as far as the internal evidence is concerned. But when we look at the external evidence, we can see that there is a mountain of misinformation that needs to be corrected, and very significant early evidence, the Old Latin Capitula, the statements of Ambrose, and the way in which it seems like they echo a Greek text, and also the use of the passage in the later lectionaries, where it is presented, not as part of the Pentecost lection, but as the lection for St. Pelagius Day, October the 8th. And I think that wraps it up. When you see a passage that's in 1,500 manuscripts, and when you see the passage that's in the early Old Latin text, there's you can say that what right does a passage have, or to rephrase, I think we're a good illustration. Possession is 9/10 of the law, and it seems to me like when you have the Old Latin Capitula and you have patristic references that are clearly much more abundant than they've been made to appear in various commentaries and in various videos, that other tenth simply does not outweigh the 9/10 that's there. And I think I can wrap it up there, and I'll be happy to take any questions, Sam.
Guys, let me again encourage you. Re-listen to this presentation. Focus on the arguments. Seek to understand what he's saying. We gave you links to his material, and we're going to make sure. And by the way, Mats, thank you for serving me for the sake of Jesus. One thing people have been telling me, that in the description box, the links to my general pages are found. But when I mention, let's say, links to specific articles, they're not included. So if any of the mods can do me a favor, when we post specific links, add those to the description box. You'd be helping me. God bless you. Nobody gets paid for helping me. They do it out of their love for the Lord. So I demand a lot for people who are doing stuff for free. But guys, I don't say this because he's here. The reason why I invited him is because I believe this. I don't remember how I ran into him, but I thank the Lord Jesus Christ. I met this man. I ran into this man because, let me, by way of testimony, because I'm going to open up for Q&A. For years, I would be afraid to quote Mark 16, verses 9 to 20, and John 7, 53 to 8:11 as inspired scripture. I had so much doubts about the authenticity of these passages, and used to trouble me because people would ask me about the woman in adultery. And I'd have to tell them, well, the evidence shows John didn't write it, but it's an early tradition, goes back to Jesus. So they try to fit it in the manuscripts to preserve it. When the Lord then had me meet this man, he's got a YouTube channel. He's got videos, discussions on this. He's got ebooks. He's quite active on his blog. Eat up the information. Eat it up. Because I promise you, if you learn his arguments, the other side cannot refute the arguments he presented because they're factual. They're based on facts. Let me ask a question, because someone was mentioning the church fathers. Could you address the fact that there were church fathers, and I believe, if memory serves me well, Augustine, who was aware of its omission and gave the reason he thought it was being omitted?
Yes, I spent a chapter in my book on Augustine, and Augustine had an interesting theory. His theory, now remember, as I'm going to date Augustine, we're talking about the early 400s in Carthage, or near Carthage in Hippo. Augustine says the passage about the woman caught in adultery, there were some mischievous, faithless folks who didn't have a faith as strong as they should have had, that were afraid that seeing this passage in the gospel would give license to their wives to commit adultery. In other words, they were afraid that their wives would plan to commit adultery, and then when they got caught, their wives were going to come back and say, "But honey, Jesus forgave the adulteress. Why don't you forgive me? Now, obviously, I'm paraphrasing, but this was the gist of what Augustine proposed, that some men were worried that their wives would see what the forgiveness of the adulteress, and they would say, well, I don't want my wife to see that passage. She might think she could get away with adultery. And so they took that passage out. That's what Augustine thought. So he clearly knew that there was some copies with the passage and some copies without. Now, Augustine wrote in Latin, but he knew a little bit of Greek, and he had some Greek copies on hand. He refers to them from time to time. For instance, he mentions his Greek copies when he's talking about Mark chapter 16, verse 12, a reading in that passage. So we know that Augustine had Greek copies, and that those Greek copies had Mark verses 16 through 20. But regarding the copies that he said, those copies that don't have it, it's because some mischievous persons worried about what their wives might misinterpret. They might not realize. Now, Jesus told the woman, go and sin no more. So they shouldn't misinterpret it that way. But just in case they would, that's why some people, being apprehensive about that, took out the passage. Now, do I buy that theory? No, I do not. I don't think that's really a credible theory. And I explain this at length in my book to say, why would any, and basically the idea is, when you look at John chapter 7, verses 53 through 8:11, you've got to answer also the question of, why would you erase the first three verses, which don't have anything to do with the adulteress? Why wouldn't you just erase the part about the adulteress? Now, it's really a kind of a killer move, you could say. That's where somebody's putting a person in check, and there's no escape. You can see how it's going to play out. It's going to play out, well, that's not a tenable theory. But I can understand why Augustine would come up with that, but that doesn't mean that he's doing anything more than guessing.
Now, for the record, and guys, this is the time to ask your questions. And just to let you know, God willing, right after this, half an hour right after this, I'm doing a live stream. A young man has questions from Jehovah's Witnesses. So my night won't be over. Right after this, Lord willing, half an hour after this stream, I'm going live to take questions, brother, concerning the Trinity again from Jehovah's Witnesses that he's witnessing to. So make sure you invite people for that. And so you have about 20 minutes to ask questions, Lord willing, and I have to wrap things up. But now, one question so people understand where you're not coming from. Lest people think that you're probably one of these nuts. You're not King James Version only. You're not Textus Receptus only. You're not majority text only. So that's not your position, right?
That is absolutely correct, Sam. I am not King James Version only. Most definitely not. I am not TR only. The TR has many mistakes. It's very capable of improvement. I am not a Byzantine text only, also called as majority text only. I'm not a Byzantine prioritist. I believe that the Byzantine has an ancient core, but if you look at its readings and compare them to the rival readings as a whole, the Byzantine text is clearly stratified with some readings that are earlier than others in it. But that's true of the other ancient text forms as well.
So you're not this wacky King James only. And by the way, I'm not disrespecting those who believe in King James as the perfect. I'm saying some people would like to, what they do, genetic fallacy or ad hominem, to discredit James Snapp so they don't give him a platform. They'll say, he's one of those wacky KJV only. So you're not arguing for the authenticity of the woman caught in adultery because you're one of these KJV only wackos.
Yeah, I have no idea how anybody could read my work for half an hour and conceive that would be remotely possible, because there are many readings in the TR that I openly reject. There are some readings in the Byzantine text that I openly reject. So yeah, anybody that says I'm KJV only or majority text prioritist just is either not familiar with my work or is just misrepresenting me.
Exactly. Amen. Now, maybe you want to do another section because I want to have you back on more often. Someone asked about John 5:4, about the angels stirring up the well. Now, if you want, if you want to do an entire session, I'd love for you to do a session on that. And by the way, just curiously, Luke 23:34, just quickly, without going into the evidence, do you believe when Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do," is that genuine scripture? Or is that interpolation?
I believe that is genuine scripture, Sam, and I have looked into that one. Others have as well. And if you look at academia.edu and just Google that phrase, Father, forgive them. I think you'll find lots of resources on there. And the evidence is very, very strong for the inclusion of the phrase. And I don't just mean the Byzantine minuscules. I mean going way back. You can see mountainous evidence favoring the inclusion of the passage. But you can also see, and this is important, you can also see why, to us, it looks like, oh yeah, that's a great passage. It's a great passage. That's not a problematic passage. You can also see why, when you look at how it was interpreted, you can see why that would appear to be the more difficult passage. Just like in Mark 1 verse 2, to not be specific, this is the specific prophet being quoted, that was a problem. It was not specific, and the problem was the non-specificity. So a name was put in there in the Alexandrian text. Now this happened very early on, but there in Luke, when it says, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do, somebody would naturally say, wait a minute, Jerusalem was destroyed. The Romans wiped it out. What do you mean, Father, forgive them? They're clearly not forgiven. Are we going to say that Jesus prayed to the Father and the Father turned him down flat? No. So the easiest solution for the bold and reckless scribes that were not there for very many generations, but they're in some of the other generations of ones that made the Western text. But the Alexandrian text also is not purely devoted to one locale. It has some other Western influence upon it that you can see in Vaticanus. Clearly, there was a tendency in some circles, not everywhere, obviously, because you can see the Byzantine text has it. But you can see a tendency in some interpreters to say, yeah, I don't think we really want Jesus to be saying that. So, boom, there it goes. Cyril of Alexandria, I think, if I recall correctly, at one point in his commentary, somebody raises the objection about the passage, and his answer is, well, we don't have to address that because it's not in our manuscript, so you're talking about nothing, and he just moves on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I asked you for that because, again, James White has convinced and swayed many to reject this authenticity, saying, I'll never preach using that passage. So maybe in the Lord willing, we'll talk about it. Maybe you can come and do a session on that. If you want to combine it with the other question that was asked, do you believe John 5, verse 4, the angel stirring up the water, is part of what John wrote?
That's one where, until I make a detailed study and possibly a manuscript or two gets examined in more detail, I think there are some things that need to be revisited. Okay. So that's one where I would be inclined to say a footnote is justified because the wording, again, varies, but also in Tertullian, contrary to some things that have been claimed about the passage, I think Bill Mounts, a video by Bill Mounts can be found where he says, oh, the early church fathers never mentioned the angel. Just read Tertullian, will you? Just open the book of Tertullian and say, Tertullian, tell me about this passage. And Tertullian mentions, although he does not explicitly say, oh yeah, here in John chapter 5, verse 4, but acting like everybody knows what he's talking about, he mentions the angel. Now that's a late 2nd century. That's an early reference. So there's a lot more going on for the passage than some commentators will inform you. And now when I say Bill Mounts, we're talking about a major contributor to the NIV, who's apparently either unaware of what Tertullian says about it or something else. So it's a closer contest, and a lot of people give it credit for. That's one where I would say, yeah, this is one that I think would justify a footnote. That's where I stand right now on it. So, all right. I don't stand very strongly for or against it.
All right. Now, with that said, this question, maybe I think we'll wrap it up with this question. And I will have him on if he's willing to come on, because this man is a wealth of information. Please, guys, pray for him, support him, get his materials. We need more James Snapps to balance out the imbalanced information on textual criticism. You wanted to add something, brother?
Oh, yeah. I have a link. You had mentioned James White at www.curtisvillecc.com / just to spell this part out, PASUPPLX.html. At that link, there are a series of buttons, and one of those buttons will take you directly, and they're all labeled. One of those buttons will take you to answers to James White's questions about the story of the woman caught in adultery. And there are other buttons there that will take you to some of these other passages that were brought up as well.
And again, for the record, I don't want people thinking that we're attacking anyone. Just like our brother James White on his dividing line will mention Christians by name and criticize their arguments and refute their arguments. What's sauce for the goose, you get the same. So it's just being brotherly and bringing out the fact. James has done some great stuff, but I have to say, when it comes to textual criticism, he needs to concede to people like James Snapp, who are much more knowledgeable in that area. And that's not trying to put him down. It's just we need to know our limitations. I'm not a textual scholar. I would never mention textual criticism. I am dependent on men like James Snapp. Now, brother, with that said, I'll make this a final question. And Lord willing, we'll talk about bringing you back. And we'll provide the links to his material. Find him on Facebook. Find him on his blog. We need to support this man. And there's some of you have your own YouTube channels and your own shows. Get a hold of this man. Invite him to your shows. Invite him to your channels. Let's get him exposure so that the world of Christianity will know about this man. But here, since you're not a Textus Receptus guy and a Byzantine guy, what readings in the TR do you reject? Because we do have some who are King James only or received text or Byzantine text. What, in your view, would be some readings, just maybe mention one or two, that are there that you reject because the evidence is not strongly in support of them?
Well, people might be wondering about 1 John 5:7, and I would say that's one that I definitely reject. I've looked into that in detail, and on that page that I just mentioned, the supplex.html, there I have a button that's just for that gives like 5 more essays that look into the details of the case, that walks through, well, what about Cyprian? Is Cyprian quoting from 1 John here? No, he's not, but he's doing something else, and I go into a detailed explanation there. So a very full treatment of why I would say that's not part of what John wrote is there already cut and dried and cooked on the platter for anybody that wants to read it. Okay, also in Ephesians 3:9, whereas the Textus Receptus says koinonia or fellowship, clearly that's a late reading that popped up as a misreading in a medieval manuscript. And not only does the vast majority of manuscripts in the Antiochian text, the text of Antioch, the text everywhere else also says administration or economia. So those would be just 2 examples. There's some other readings that are clearly influenced by lectionaries, that are just little expansions that don't really change the meaning, but just make the meaning clearer. Those are very, very benign readings. They're not original, but the non-original aspect is just to make the original meaning more clearer. And this is something where we have a difference between the Byzantine text and the Alexandrian text. In the Byzantine text, you might have some barnacles on the ship. In the Alexandrian text, you have some holes in the ship.
You guys understand that analogy? Barnacles versus holes. The Alexandrian text, which scholars like Daniel Wallace swear by, because supposedly they're the earliest attested, they have holes, whereas the Byzantine have barnacles. So understand what he's just telling you. The Byzantine textual tradition is vastly superior. There may be barnacles, but not holes. What would you say about Acts 8:37? We can end it with that, and you can add any more comments. Acts 8:37, is that something you reject?
That's a minority reading, but it has very early patristic support. Irenaeus, Cyprian, and some others quite a bit. And again, there's a file about Acts 8:37 in which I defend its authenticity, and I also explain what caused it to be lost. Again, it's related to how the manuscript was used and how they were marked up for lectures. That is kind of a parallel, which kind of relates in a way in John chapter 9. In some of the early manuscripts, the same ones that don't have the story of the woman caught in adultery, where the blind man is coming back to Jesus and he worships him, that little snippet there in verses 38 and 39 of John chapter 9, it's just missing. I mean, it doesn't make any sense that it would be missing. And we don't even see a footnote of it in most of the modern translations. I think the New Living Translation has a footnote about it. But most of them just say, well, it's just a glitch, which it is. But how did the glitch happen? By the same kind of mechanism that happened to Acts 8:37. Because and I think later scholars like Metzger said, well, it looks like something that would be useful for the church at baptisms. You have that confession of faith. Well, yeah, but that also makes it something very useful for Luke to write. And in my paper on that can be downloaded for free, I go into more details about that reading. Which is, like I said, it's only in about 15% of the manuscripts, but it's very, very early.
Thank you. There was a phenomenal session. Go ahead, brother. Go ahead.
Speaking of early manuscripts, it's often assumed that early means better. And I think Bill Mounts is guilty of making this connection very badly, of saying because a manuscript is earlier, it must be better. Earlier just means it's lasted longer. The humidity level in Egypt is very low. It's very dry. Everywhere else, practically, where Greek New Testament manuscripts went in the other church, the humidity level was much higher. And so papyrus, the material that the manuscripts are written on, the papyrus naturally rotted away, except in Egypt, because there it's dry and they don't decompose like they do everywhere else. So, of course, the oldest manuscripts are going to be from Egypt. And because the Alexandrian text is there in Egypt, of course, that's what the oldest manuscripts are going to have. It doesn't mean the manuscripts everywhere else just popped out of the ground like from nowhere. They were echoing their ancestors. But in Egypt, when it says we have the oldest manuscripts, if you're always going to say we're going to follow the oldest manuscripts, like what you see in so many Bible footnotes, so the oldest manuscripts say this, the oldest manuscripts say that, you're guaranteed to get a text from a manuscript taken out of Egypt if it happened to have a papyrus behind it. And so that's the question. When you take, say, your average medieval minuscule and your average papyrus copy, say Papyrus 45 or P66, and compare their text to the text of the average medieval minuscule, and I've done this over a dozen times on my blog, compare the text that's in that papyrus from Egypt to the average minuscule from that has the Byzantine readings in it. Compare those to Nessel-Aland. Using Nessel-Aland as your standard, the medieval manuscript is more accurate than the text from that papyrus. I know it sounds very surprising, but just walk through the data and you'll reach the same conclusion. Anybody can walk through the data and reach the same conclusion. So just saying oldest manuscript is a fallacy. It's a presumption. However reasonable it might appear, in real life, it doesn't pan out that way.
Amen. Now, before I conclude, they keep asking this question and they want your feedback. What English translation of the Bible do you recommend they read? They keep asking that question.
Well, the perfect translation is yet to be made, and as soon as it comes out, the language will probably change in 100 years, and people say, well, we don't understand it anymore, we got to make a new one. Part of the problem of English translations, not only textually, but also when it comes to the translation method is, do we want something, a standard all-purpose translation like the King James, which most people don't. I mean, that's what it was when it came out. But now, is it all-purpose? I would say it's not, because it's hard to understand. But of the major translations on the market, I would say the least worst in that respect is the New King James. After that, the World English Bible, which is all based on it's supposedly based on the majority text. It's still a work in progress at some points. There's also some translations that are made that don't really have a big publishing house behind them, like the Mitchell translation. It's an independently made version by the guy that made a Scribal Skips, which I have here somewhere. And but that is one that's worth looking at. There's another one called the New Heart translation. Also, a group of Lutherans has recently made what's called the Evangelical Heritage version, the E3. I've got a review of that on my blog. It's just one of those buttons that scroll down on the page I mentioned, and you'll find it. I would say if somebody wants a translation that takes all the text lines into account, but doesn't automatically assume the Alexandrian reading, like basically like what Hort did and textual scholars did for 2 generations after Hort. If somebody wants to give an equitable account to the Byzantine text, certainly not a full 100% representation of it, but considerable, treating it somewhat fairly. Now, of course, I would tweak it here and there, but the evangelical heritage version, I would give that a serious look if somebody's out there is looking at a translation they want to adopt as their translation above the ESV, certainly above the NIV. And I would say if they were horses in a race, the New King James Version would still be ahead, but the Evangelical Heritage Version would be right alongside it.
Okay, so also, guys, go ahead.
The World English Translation and a New Heart Translation again would never hit the top 10, but also worth considering.
By the way, the World English Bible that he's referring to, New King James, and the Evangelical Heritage Translation, those 3 are on BibleGateway.com for free. So Evangelical Heritage Translation, he told you, New King James, World English Bible, those 3 are on BibleGateway.com, which you can read for free. The New Heart Translation, I don't know where you can find that, but Google it. And then the Mitchell Translation, now I'm going to look for it because of his recommendation. Now, with that said,
I should have a caution. There's another Mitchell that also made a translation, which I don't recommend. So be careful which one you pick.
All right. So with that said, it was an honor again to have my favorite textual scholar in the Bible. And why is he my favorite? Number one, he worships and loves the triune God. He loves Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior. He believes Jesus is the God-man risen. Believes the Bible is the inspired, perfectly preserved Word of God. It's preserved there in the extant manuscripts. And he's a scholar of textual criticism who has looked at all sides and hasn't simply toed the party line and paired it with other scholars say, because his allegiance is to God and his truth, not to the scholarly guild. And I thank the Lord for him and pray for him. We're going to put the links to his material in the description box. You can find him on Facebook. Send him a friend request, James E. Snapp. The man is brilliant. He's a gift to the Church of Jesus Christ. Go ahead, brother.
I'd just like to note, if anybody out there is just starting out with asking questions about textual criticism, about looking into manuscripts and stuff, I am preparing a series of lectures, and they are online for free. They're about half an hour or less each one. So far, I have 12 of them online. Just go to my YouTube channel, James Snapp Jr., and they're there on a playlist. I plan to be making more, God willing. But so far, there are 12 that should give you an idea of the history, the materials, and so forth, and some of the issues as well involving the field of New Testament textual criticism.
Yep. Go to his YouTube channel. Make it explode. Subscribe. Watch the videos. We want him to get hundreds of thousands of subscribers. He needs to be known in the world of Christian academia and apologetics. And we love you, brother. And I'll be in contact with you. I'm going to bring you back, God willing, sooner than later. Thank you, sir. It was an honor for you to join us, and thank Jesus for you. May he preserve you for his glory. Guys, half an hour. I'm going live with questions from the Jehovah's Witnesses against the Trinity. Half an hour, God willing.